source, government says very purpose of state of emergency is to avert threats against nation. And the US threatens to impose sanctions on Ethiopia using humanitarian crisis as pretext. Hello, many thanks for joining us. You're watching Addis News Hour with the news. I'm Tabitha John. Do stay with us. The House of People's Representatives has approved the state of emergency that was referred to it by the Council of Ministers last Tuesday. The state of emergency will remain in force for 6 months. It is indicated in the proclamation document that the terrorist TPLF and its affiliates pose a grave and imminent danger against the existence and sovereignty of the country. It is to be recalled that the Council of Ministers declared the state of emergency in a bid to protect the community and the nation at large from the security threat posed by the terrorist group. The proclamation is needed considering the gravity of the killings, lootings, and other cruel and inhumane attacks that are being perpetrated by the terrorist TPLF and its affiliates against civilians in several parts of the country. Ministry of Justice says the very purpose of the state of emergency is to avert the threat posed against national existence and sovereignty. This remark came while the Ministry of Justice with Foreign Affairs briefed Addis Ababa-based diplomatic communities on the state of emergency concerns. Goshu Melisau has compiled the following account.
We are not concerned about the state of emergency.
The protection that the government will be taken.
Joint briefing of the Ministry of Justice and Foreign Affairs to the Addis-based diplomatic communities indicated the very purpose of the state of emergency is to avert the threat posed against national existence and sovereignty.
The objective of the proclamation and the need for it arises out of the fact that we are facing a grave threat against national sovereignty, not only our national sovereignty, but the territorial integrity of the state. We believe that the TPLF and its terrorist proxies and allies are posing a grave threat, some might even say an existential threat to the Ethiopian state. Under these circumstances, to avert this danger, we have found it to be necessary to provide the appropriate law enforcement agencies, security agencies, with additional powers to counter this threat. So that is the objective and the necessity of the proclamation.
Gideon highlighted except diplomatic impunity and other privileges in accordance with Vienna Convention, other substantive procedural laws inconsistent with proclamation shall remain suspended.
With the exception of the diplomatic immunities and privileges provided under that convention, other substantive and procedural laws inconsistent with this proclamation shall remain suspended during the implementation of this proclamation. So while the immunities and the privileges that arise out of this convention, while this convention remains intact, other substantive laws, other procedural laws and rules that are inconsistent with the proclamation will be suspended.
Some diplomatic communities questioned about the protection and timeline of proclamation.
What will be the protection that the government will be taken for the diplomatic corps and their families is one of the questions. The second, if the curfew will be implemented, what will be the timeline?
The state of emergency proclamation is expected to be applicable. It's expected to be operational for the next 6 months since the date of its adoption.
The statement said additional directives will be issued in the coming days for more clarification.
There could be additional directives that could be issued in the coming few days to clarify some aspects of the state of emergency proclamation and to make some aspects of the proclamation more effectively operational.
The state of emergency will be operational for 6 months throughout the country and probably will be extended according to constitutional provision.
U.S. President Joe Biden has sent his special envoy for the Horn of Africa to Ethiopia to push for an end to increased fighting that has worsened fears of an unfolding humanitarian disaster. Jeffrey Feltman is sent to Ethiopia to urge Ethiopia's government and the terrorist Tigray People's Liberation Front TPLF to come to the negotiation table. State Minister of Foreign Affairs Redwan Hussein says Ethiopia is ready to hear from the envoy. Listen to him.
Damage sustained, and then this is the last best opportunities that we could capitalize on to avoid such catastrophe. And then I hope the other side will listen to that, and we also hope the international community could capitalize on this situation to force the other side and then iron out, because there are attempts. UN already assigned special envoy. I think we are expecting Obasanjo to arrive soon, and we are ready to listen to what he has to offer and what he has to come up with as a solution.
A joint investigation by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UN Human Rights Office said no genocide act was committed in northern Ethiopia during the 8-month-long conflict. The report labeled rights violations as crimes against humanity. This came when the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UN Human Rights Office issued a press conference over human rights situation during the stated period. Goshu Melliso has this report.
TPLF sympathizers and some of its western cronies have been accusing Ethiopia for human rights violations in Tigray. For nearly a year, international media outlets, TPLF sympathizers as well as some extremist diaspora cried foul about genocide in Tigray. However, a joint report by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission found no hints of such crimes. The report covers the period between November 3, 2021 and June 28, 2021. The joint investigation team visited various localities in both Tigray and Amhara states. The joint investigation team conducted 269 confidential interviews with victims and witnesses of alleged violations and abuses and other sources. It also held over 60 meetings with federal and regional officials, representatives of international organizations and other sources. Chief of Human Rights Commission Daniel Bekele said there are reasonable grounds to believe that all parties have committed crime against humanity and war crime. However, this was challenged by the Ethiopian government, which clearly indicated that it has reservations about some of the findings by the report.
The violations we have identified may amount to crimes against humanity or war crimes and a number of other violations, but not genocide. That's clearly stated in the report.
Daniel said his team faced no pressure from the Ethiopian government, lauding the government's commitment for the investigation.
We have faced various challenges as outlined in the report, but the investigation team has not been subjected to any direct influence or pressure or any direct interference from government or any other sources.
It is to be recalled that the TPLF and its sympathizers accused the Ethiopian government of using starvation as a weapon. However, the report failed to corroborate wild accusations by the TPLF and its sympathizers that the Ethiopian government used starvation as a weapon of war. However, the report fails to convince even an ordinary observer, given it took an entire year to complete.
The joint investigation team did not confirm that there is a deliberate or willful denial of humanitarian assistance to the civilian population in Tigray, or the use of starvation as a weapon of war.
Similarly, the report admitted that blocking of aid was committed during the conflict. The Joint Investigation Team report recommended armed forces to end all violations, abuses and protect civilians and refrain from destroying civilian infrastructure. Daniel indicated that investigations are underway as the TPLF is committing grave atrocities, expanding the war into neighboring Amhara and Afar.
አባቶቻችን የተረከብንሽ እናት ሀገራችን የምንወድሽ ለጅብ ይሁን እንጂ ለአሞራ ስጋችን አንቺ አትደፈሪም ይፈሳል ደማችን ተከብረሽ ኑርሺው በአባቶቻችን ደም በአባቶቻችን ደም እናት ኢትዮጵያ የደፈረሽው ደም የደፈረሽው ደም አንድ ላይ ተከብረሽ ኑርሺው በአባቶቻችን ደም በአባቶቻችን ደም እናት ኢትዮጵያ የደፈረሽው ደም የደፈረሽው ደም ተከብረሽ ኑርሺው በአባቶቻችን ደም በአባቶቻችን ደም በአባቶቻችን ደም እናት ኢትዮጵያ የደፈረሽው ደም የደፈረሽው ደም
Welcome back. You're watching Addis News Hour. Freelance photojournalist and former staffer with over 30 years shooting experience, shooting in the US and Africa, and a former resident of Addis Ababa, Jamal Kaunes, wrote an article explaining the TPLF terrorist group's brutal and inhumane atrocities over the people of Amhara. He summarizes the real facts behind the Northern Command attacks 1 year ago. Kazahun Channi tells you more.
In his article, Jamal Countess, a renowned freelance photojournalist, depicted that it was exactly this time a full year ago, about 10 p.m. Ethiopian time, on November 3, 2020, that commandos of the Tigray Special Forces and affiliated TPLF-aligned militias attacked 5 bases of the Northern Command of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, gaining control of the bases and seizing what has been reported as over 60% of the country's heavy ordnance, automatic weapons and mechanized assets. In addition to the looted weapons, unconfirmed reports, which cannot be verified due to the sensitive nature of the information, claim that over 6,000 soldiers of the Ethiopian National Defense Force were massacred or tortured and killed beyond the initial surprise nighttime attacks of November 3 and ensuing battles on November 4. Sources close to the ENDF claim the numbers are significantly higher, but revealing those numbers during an ongoing conflict may harm the all-round war effort. These attacks on the Northern Command were part of a larger plan that was to culminate in a TPLF taking control of Ethiopia in just 2 weeks, marching on Addis Ababa and seizing control from Abiy Ahmed, the current Prime Minister of Ethiopia. So when the killing started on November 3rd at the Northern Command bases, local farm owners, most of whom happened to be retired TPLF military officers, started silently killing their ethnic Amhara day laborers. These killings took place after the day laborers were made to harvest crops which were then sent to Mekelle. The laborers had their pay withheld for a week, claiming it was coming the following week, but the only payment for their labors most of these workers received was death. They were shot in most cases, cut with sharp instruments in other cases. Their bodies were either buried on the land they harvested or removed to multiple dam sites around Maikadra in the middle of the night. The murderers, the retired TPLF officers and generals fleeing to Mekelle with harvest gathered by their former employees. The next few days will be spent honoring the dead, those who had their lives snuffed out because a group of power-hungry terrorists wanted to return to power, even though 100 million people rejected their leadership. Give them your time, your empathy, and your sympathy. He watched the towers fall from Brooklyn that September morning, and almost 3,000 of my neighbors perished in the inferno and collapse of the Twin Towers, he said. But Ethiopia experienced that national trauma. In effect, 3 times in 1 week, over 7,600 people died, lost their lives due to the TPLF's murderous desire to subjugate Ethiopia again. Let one memorize and remember and pay respect to all of those lost, the freelance photojournalist underscored.
In business news, the U.S. has been threatening to impose sanctions on Ethiopia, using humanitarian crisis as a pretext to put pressure on the government. One of its leverages appears to be the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA. Last Tuesday, the Biden administration announced that Ethiopia and 2 other African nations were banned from the Opportunity Act. The decision dismayed Ethiopians. Solomon Danye tells us more.
It's been months since the Biden administration started to intimidate the Ethiopian government under the guise of humanitarian concerns in relation with the Tigray conflict. From threatening to impose sanctions on government officials to suspending the country from the Africa Growth Opportunity Act, AGOA, the US used all its leverage to make the Ethiopian government bow to its orders. The Ethiopian government and economists have been expressing concerns over US's plan to suspend the East African nation from AGOA, citing the vulnerability of daily laborers whose lives are highly dependent on trade systems like AGOA. Many argued that using AGOA as a pretext for humanitarian concern is a paradox by itself, that the suspension is a direct attack to the poor households. In an article he wrote to argue on the issue, Mamo Mehretu, a senior policy advisor to Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and Ethiopia's chief trade negotiator, strongly reproached the move, saying that removal of AGOA eligibility would only worsen the condition of ordinary Ethiopians who have no connection to the Tigray conflict. Though the concern of the US about peace and security in Ethiopia is shared by many people around the world, removing it from AGOA would only expose the fledgling manufacturing in the country to an existential threat, Mamo said. Defying all legitimate concerns of the government and experts in the field, the US on Tuesday announced that it suspended Ethiopia and 2 other African nations from AGOA until these countries meet what the US is asking them to do. Reacting on the decision, the Ethiopian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in its statement dubbed the move as misguided. The ministry said the decision fails to take into account the commitment of the government of the United States to value the well-being of ordinary citizens. The statement added that though the government of Ethiopia understands the human rights concerns of the United States government over the ongoing conflict in northern Ethiopia, such concerns over human rights issues do not warrant the decision of the US to suspend Ethiopia's privilege over the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA. According to the ministry, the decision will affect the livelihoods of more than 200,000 low-income families, mostly women who've got nothing to do with the conflict.
ላንቱ ለገሞ ባላለው 4 አመት ሆኖብኛል 4 ልጆች አሉኝ ይሄ ፋብሪካ የሚጠፋ ከሆነ እኔ የሚኖርበት ተይና ልጆቼን የሚያስቀምጥበት ቦታ አይታየኝም ለኔ እንዴት ሆናለሁ ይሄው 4 አመት ሙሉ እዚህ እየሰራው ነኝ በሱ ያስተዳደርኩ ነኝ እንዳይዘጉ አንዴ ለምናለሁ
ኢንዱስትሪ ፓርኩ መኖሩ ለኔ ይጠቅመኛል እና ይሄ ከዚህ ስራ የተሻለውን ለመስራት በሚገባ ኢንዱስትሪ ፓርኩ ያስፈልገኛል
ከስተመሮቼ በአብዛኛው የኢንዱስትሪ ልጆች ናቸው እነሱ ካላሉ ደግሞ ምንም መስራት አልችልም የኔ ወይም ጠፋች ማለት ነው
When the AGOA was introduced in 2000, Ethiopia exported goods worth $28 million to the United States. In 2020, that figure rose roughly tenfold and stood at close to $300 million, nearly half of it under the AGOA. Today, the two most successful exporting industries under the AGOA, apparel and leather, employ about 200,000 people directly, 80% of them young women. In Hawassa Industrial Park alone, 95% of the employees are women, providing in many cases the first ever jobs for young families. The country's removal from AGOA would deal a serious blow to the welfare of millions of low-income workers. Taking these into account, many are doubting whether the US cares about the poor.
As part of expanding investments in neighboring countries, Ethiopian-owned NOC Djibouti has signed an agreement with a China construction company to significantly renovate and modernize a service station worth $1.3 million on Wednesday. Commending the Minister of Energy and the Ethiopian ambassador to Djibouti for their incredible support to facilitate conducive investment environment, manager of NOC Djibouti, Fasil Woldemariam, reiterated NOC Djibouti's commitment to contribute alongside public and private partners to the economic and social development of Djibouti. It is to be recalled that the NOC Djibouti invested in the construction of a new service station in areas known as PK12 in 2020, which was commissioned at the beginning of 2021.
አገራችን እየተበጠበጠ እናት ወንድሞቻችን እየተገደሉ ምናምን አይተናል እና እኛ እሱን ለማቅረፍ ነው የመጣነው ከእናት ሀገሬ ፍለፊት ሆኜ ለማዋጋት ሀገሬን ለማስከበር የመጣው ኢትዮጵያ መሆናችን በጣም ስለምኮራ ወደዚህ አካባቢ መጣነው ወደ መከላከያ ሰራዊት የተቀላቀልነው ማለት እናት ሀገራችንን ለማዳን ኢትዮጵያዊነት ለኔ ኩራቴ ነው ግርማ ሞገሴ ነው መካበታለሁ በኢትዮጵያ በመሆኔ በጣም ደስ ይለኛል አባታችን ወታደር ቤት 18 አመት አገልግሏል ሻለቃው ነው ከዛ መጥቶ ነው እኛ ያሳደገ እኛ ተወልደን እሱ ወታደር ቤት ያገለገለ ነበር ለእናት አገልግሎ ይሄ ሁሉ ሰራዊት እያለ ደግሞ ሀገራችን አትወድቅም
And finally, pro-military Sudanese minister briefed the press on Wednesday and said he was optimistic the country will achieve its democracy.